Well, UCT law professor Richard Calland is withdrawn as a member of the panel that was formed to investigate the Phala Phala Farm saga. Calland came under scrutiny by political parties who said he's biased towards President Cyril Ramaphosa. In a statement, he says he strongly rejects any allegation of bias, but says he's stepping down because it might not be in the best interests of that parliamentary process to serve on the panel. Advocate Mahlape Sello now takes over from him. So let's unpack this further. We're joined now with public law expert Professor Cathleen Powell of our video link. Prof, it's great to have you with us, as always, here on the AM Report. And I want to begin with this. It's about questions of bias, but is it more actually about the perception of bias, whether that's true or not? And as I said, it's an allegation that Richard Calland has strongly rejected.
The point he's made, that he's withdrawing because of the perception rather than the bias. And that is an approach that is taken when we deal with bias in the judiciary. I'm not sure it's as suited to decision makers in the rest of South African society or in other organs of government. But yes, the issue, as he has emphasized, is that because there is a perception that he might be biased, he wants to withdraw so that the process that follows can have maximum buy-in from the South African public.
And that's the point, isn't it? You don't want to be distracted by the makeup of the panel when the focus should be on the work of the panel and what recommendations actually come out after their 30 days of deliberations.
That is true. On the other hand, the makeup of the panel is determined in part by the panel's expertise. And for the panel to have expertise, it's going to have some knowledge of the political life and the legal wranglings of the people in the dispute before it. So it's impossible to get complete newbies to come into the panel and think, oh, good, they're going to be unbiased, because they actually need to be able to process the information that they're given. Now, what seems to have been a problem with Richard Calland is that he's been a political commentator and a legal commentator. And the political commentary has been often in favor of President Ramaphosa, and that's seen as a sign of bias. But of course, what he's needed to do here in this particular job is to examine the legal side, the theft and the facts and what happened, and to look at evidence and weigh it up. Now, that draws on one's talents as a lawyer rather than one's talents as a political commentator. Yeah,
in fact, he had he did a podcast with our colleague in the industry, Eusebius McKaiser, and that's exactly what he also talks about, his ability as a lawyer to look at the facts and to comment, to keep a distance from those facts and to comment without any bias.
Yes, bias would indicate that there is information you're simply not prepared to entertain, or information that you're going to rely on to the exclusion of everything else, or it indicates that you've made your decision up front.
Right.
Now, it's very hard for lawyers and judges to make their decision up front because they have to provide reasons for the decision that they reach. So they have to actually say how they got from A to B. So look, I think at a professional level, any halfway competent lawyer is going to do a fairly good job of assessing evidence. It's one of the things that we get taught to do. On the other hand, because this is a political arena and a highly contentious one, I can understand why Richard Calland and the Speaker rather chose to avoid any controversy. But we must be aware that whatever this panel decides, the matter is now so mired in controversy that any party that doesn't like the outcome is going to make some allegations of bias. Because we've seen that whenever judgments come out of courts, where you have definitely equipped people with no proof of bias, making decisions, giving good explanations for their decisions, they also get accused of bias.
So you're saying one way or the other, there was always going to be some sort of... I think removing Richard Calland might have stopped some of the fire for now, but it's going to come, no matter what this panel decides. And no matter, this is the tragic bit, no matter how well it substantiates its decision. So perhaps this is the time for South Africans to start learning how evidence works rather than to decide which particular people they trust to make an unbiased decision. I mean, that's a broader discussion, isn't it, Prof, around whether we can, as analysts, as commentators, as journalists even, whether we can toe this line in the kind of society that we find ourselves in, and have, occupy a single narrow view, because I suppose that's what's expected if you're going to be on a panel and there's absolutely no whiff of bias around you.
And yet you would know as a journalist that to be an effective and worthwhile journalist, you've got to actually investigate and go behind any claim made. You can't keep a narrow view. And similarly, the people on the panel are going to have to interrogate every bit of evidence that comes to them. Remember how former President Zuma accused the Zondo Commission of bias because he was being cross-examined. That mere fact of having to check, look, you've said X, but that doesn't fit with Y. That's part of a lawyer's job, to check that the evidence that has been provided is in fact accurate. That's going to have to happen in the Phala Phala panel. They're going to have to be rigorous about examining all the evidence, and that's going to get them accused of bias one way or the other.
I mean, the fact that Richard Calland penned the Zuma years, South Africa's changing face of power. I haven't read the book myself, but I'm just doing a quick Google search to sort of gauge what it's about. And it's sort of a look behind the inner machinations of exactly what the title says, the Zuma years. He's got that context and he's got that perspective, but perhaps that book is another thing that puts him in line to be accused of bias one way or another.
Well, exactly. It puts him in one camp instead of another. But the point is, if we can't start speaking a common language, which is what are the facts and how can they be analyzed to give us a reliable legal analysis, if we can't start doing that, then there's no point in this whole process. We can't decide an investigation by which camp has the strongest representation. We have to decide an investigation by what the evidence is and how it should be weighed up through legal training. And so, yes, I think Richard Calland has been placed in the wrong camp because of his book. But it worries me that the camp that he's coming from is becoming the deciding factor rather than, firstly, his expertise, and secondly, the actual arguments that the Phala Phala Commission panel produces when it produces its findings. Remember that the Section 89 inquiry on the impeachment of the of Public Protector Kobani, that was a 103-page careful analysis of all of the evidence that had been provided against the Public Protector. And it was still accused of bias.
Yeah. I suppose the question, as the Section 89 independent panel begins its work, is the process doomed even before it begins?
No, not if the media and commentators and everybody else works really hard to try explain what about this process is trustworthy and how it should be run. I'm not saying it can't make mistakes, and if it does make mistakes, those must be criticized. But I think it's an ongoing job to keep educating the public on what the virtues are of an independent inquiry process and what an independent inquiry looks like. And we need to keep challenging this narrative that as long as you come from one camp, you're going to decide X, and if you come from another, you're going to decide Y, because then we actually haven't got the basis of a communal society anymore.
Yeah. Ironically, commentators like Professor Richard Calland are the people that we're going to be looking to. Professor Cathleen Powell, let me thank you for your time this morning weighing in on this discussion. Professor of Public Law at UCT, Cathleen Powell.